Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bianca Davis, and I'm the CEO of New Friends, New Life. We are a nonprofit agency here in Dallas that has been serving survivors of sex trafficking and exploitation since 1998. Through the case management of basic needs, trauma-informed counseling, and economic empowerment that includes an on-site legal clinic, employment partnerships, and an on-site learning academy, our vision is to create a community where women and girls can soar above the limits of their past to achieve their dreams. Each year, we help 350 women and girls do just that. As you may know, human trafficking is the fastest growing and second largest criminal enterprise in the world behind the drug trade. And here in Texas, we rank second on the list of highest number of trafficking victims in the US. In Dallas alone, traffickers are profiting $99 million a year on the sale of other human beings. While New Friends, New Life and other agencies in our community are working tirelessly to support survivors, we must also find a way to address the demand and to enact policies that hold traffickers and buyers accountable while supporting those victimized by this crime. And that's exactly what we'll be discussing over the next hour or so today. I want to thank each of you for answering the call to be a part of this important discussion. In this room sits policymakers, law enforcement, civic leaders, elected officials, advocates, allies, educators, partners, and friends. You will have time to network after the event, but I want to take this moment to especially acknowledge a few individuals. We have Chad Meacham, for the U.S. Attorney over the Northern District, Abe McLaughlin, U.S. Attorney over the Eastern District. We have several other U.S. attorneys and AUSAs representing those offices here today as well. If you're here, please stand. We have representatives, thank you. We have representatives from the Dallas County District Attorney's Office. If you're here, please stand. Members of the Dallas County Juvenile Department, our Dallas Police Department and the Special Investigations Division. We have representatives from Senator Cornyn's office. Great to see you, Brian. Representatives from Senator Ted Cruz's office. Representatives from Representative Morgan Meyer's office. Representatives from the Dallas County Commissioner's Office, representing Dr. Alba Garcia. Partners from the City of Dallas, led by Council Member Gay Donnell Willis, who you will hear from in just a minute. I really could introduce every person in this room, but I will just say this. Speaking on behalf of those of us involved in agency work, hear me when I say we need you. We need each of you to continue in your commitment to connecting the dots, supporting survivors, and holding perpetrators accountable. Thank you once again for showing up today. This day would not be possible without Dr. Elizabeth Wheaton Paramo, who wears many hats here at SMU, and let's take this moment to thank SMU for hosting this event today for us. They're long-term partners of New Friends, New Life and our work. One of the roles she has is serving as chair of the SMU Human Trafficking Data Research Project. Beth, if you would join me to share a few words on behalf of the work you're doing, please join me now.
I've been teaching all morning. I don't usually get applause, so it's a little odd. I'm an economist. Economics of human rights is what I do. If you Google economics human trafficking, you'll also find me under Wheaton, not the promo yet. We got started really working at the research around the Super Bowl in Arlington. And during that time, we were building economics theoretical models, but you couldn't test them because the data is sitting in silos all over the place. Behind government walls and behind agency walls and behind nonprofit walls and behind any walls that you want. But the problem is that you cannot answer big questions with small data. And so to be able to bring the data together through many great things that happened, we were able to, including my partner, Mateo Langston-Smith there, data science. I have to say that because I'm an economist. I don't actually deal with the data. I just make things up, and then they make it happen. It's wonderful. It built a human trafficking data warehouse. The Human Trafficking Data Warehouse is a place for owners of human trafficking data to securely collect data, store it, clean it up, fill in the gaps, analyze it, disseminate it, visualize it, all those things. The goal is to have open hands with the data so that instead of having all the data stuck in one place so that nobody can use that piece of data, instead there are ways that even very secure data, we can share some of that data and bring it together, overlap it with other data, use amazing, amazing research, which is what a university and all the universities do, to answer bigger questions. And that's what we've built here. Very happy for Bianca to contact me and say, hey, we'd like to have this event at SMU. Always happy to have SMU, different people come to SMU. The economics department is kind of the behind me supporting your being here today. So it's pretty amazing to have an economics department anywhere supporting anti-human trafficking work, but ours does, and we're happy that you're here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Beth, for answering all of the calls and all of the emails in the middle of exams and spring break and everything else. We really appreciate you. Next, I would like to introduce Councilmember Gay Donnell Willis, who serves as the chair of the Mayor's Advisory Council on Domestic Violence and Human Trafficking, and who has prioritized finding solutions to trafficking at the city level, including supporting the creation of Dallas's first ever human trafficking dashboard that New Friends, New Life has been happy to collaborate with the city and with other anti-trafficking agencies on. Please welcome Councilmember Willis to the podium.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being here today. And I agree, everyone here is important and plays a vital role in helping us manage and hopefully eradicate human trafficking. So in January, I was in Austin for Human Trafficking Awareness Day, and I have to say that in a political climate that we've been in lately, to hear the bipartisan, by-chamber support and the bills being filed and the understanding that there is recognition that not just the trafficker and the buyer are part of this, but that there are victims. And so the fact that these three pillars were coming together and reaching so many legislators, and I know that is because of the work that you all are doing, going to Austin, making them aware of this and keeping this issue in front of them. So a hard part of being a council member is getting calls or emails about what are you going to do about Harry Hines, and these women are on the street, and that's a tough conversation to have at first, but it's also a point of entry to be able to educate people that the thoughts that you've had before and what you've always thought about what you might see at the street level, actually you've got to peel back some layers there and understand what's really going on. And so we take that opportunity, my staff, Dominique Jones and Farah Ali, who are also here today, to work on educating those folks. And I do hope turning some of them into donors and supporters of New Friends, New Life on occasion. It's also difficult when I get those calls or emails and it's about, well, send DPD out. Can't you do something about this? Can't you just clean this up? And I've learned over time how difficult it can be to make an arrest, to put together a case, to make something actually stick, so that it's not just circular, where we're arresting a buyer or trafficker and then they're coming right back out, but rather putting a case together where justice is truly delivered. So thank you for mentioning the human trafficking dashboard. That is something that the city has done to work on exposure and frequent resources for nonprofits, for the community, for the media to be able to use. But the other thing we can do is to disrupt, and that is what today is about, is disrupting the buyer side. So exposing the buyer is important. This is a very vital part of this. Thank you to the media that are here today. We look forward to hearing how you treat this and the exposure that you give. But we could do a better job of this at the city. I checked in with our interim police chief, Igo, so what's been going on lately? And he said, since January 1, so for 3 months, there have been 10 stings and 43 arrests. And I was like, people have got to know about this. If we truly want buyers to disrupt their behavior, it's about exposing what we're going to see today. And when we are out there arresting these buyers, it needs to be in public. We need to make sure that they know that if they're going to engage in that behavior, that they are absolutely going to be exposed. And I think it's up to us to do a better job of telling that story. So thank you all so much for being here today. Really appreciate you putting it together. Thank you, SMU. Thank you, Bianca.
Thank you so much. And now to the purpose of today's event, which also would not have happened if it weren't for the Jensen Project. I see Sarah here from the Jensen Project. So it was last September when New Friends, New Life joined agencies from across the country as a part of the 2024 Grant Tank cohort hosted by the Jensen Project. And it was over lunch that Yasmin, Ashley, where's Ashley Staggers, and I started talking about this report that they were working on and where we first hatched the idea of bringing this critical information to Dallas. And here we are. Can you even believe it? I want to thank the Jensen Project for fostering collaboration and data-driven impact in the nonprofit space. It's very important. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Yasmin Vafa, co-founder and executive director of Rights for Girls, a national human rights organization dedicated to ending gender-based violence against women and girls. Yasmin is an award-winning human rights attorney and advocate who serves on the U.S. Advisory Committee on the Sex Trafficking of Children and Youth and has an extensive history of service on other national task forces and committees. She is passionate and compassionate and focuses her work on the intersection of race, gender, violence, and law. Fresh in from DC like an hour or two ago, please give a warm Dallas welcome to Yasmin Vafa.
Thank you so much, Bianca. Thank you. It's such a privilege to be with all of you. And I want to thank New Friends, New Life for helping to coordinate this event. I want to thank Ashley Staggers from our team for all of her work in organizing this, SMU for hosting us, and everyone for being here to talk about what is a very hard but very important topic, and that is the subject of sex buyers and demand. We are an organization that's based in Washington, D.C. Rights for Girls is a human rights organization that works to support young women and girls who are impacted by gender-based violence all over the country. And we are privileged to work alongside survivor leaders, one of whom is joining us here today, Melanie Thompson from New York City. And we work with survivor leaders all over the country. And one of the consistent messages that we have heard from survivors all over the country and really all over the globe is that there isn't enough attention paid to sex buyers, and that they have consistently experienced just as much, if not more, violence at the hand of sex buyers as they have from their exploiters, their traffickers, and their pimps. And so it was very important for us to put together this report, Buyers Unmasked, to really dispel with many of the myths and tropes around buyers as, harmless, as innocuous, as shy guys who, can't get dates. And so much of this report was inspired by the work of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. My brilliant co-author, Nora Hennick, who you'll hear from in a moment, is here as well. She is from CATW, and they did an amazing report around sex buyers in New York State. And what they did was pull these quotes from buyers all throughout the state. And when we saw that, it was incredibly powerful. And we realized that, all of this advocacy that we had been doing all across the country with survivors, shoulder to shoulder, talking about the harms of sex buyers was not as powerful as letting buyers speak for themselves. And so we wanted to make this national. And we came together with this report. And our goals were really to expose the ways in which sex buyers speak and think about the people that they purchase for sexual acts. And so what we did was go through these hobby boards. And for those who are unfamiliar, these are websites in which sex buyers go and they talk amongst themselves and they rate and review the individuals, mostly women, sometimes girls, that they purchase for sex. For lack of a better comparison, kind of like Yelp but for prostitution. And they rate and review these individuals very candidly. And there's some free websites and there's paid websites. We used USA Sex Guide and Utopia Guide, and we did not edit them, we did not spell check them, and we let buyers speak for themselves. Buyers in their own words is what we called it. One of our other goals was to highlight the demographic differences between sex buyers and victims in the sex trade. So sex trade survivors, both minors as well as adults in the sex trade, and to really highlight those inequalities. We also sought to promote some of the innovative and proven demand reduction strategies throughout the US. There are many really interesting solutions that states and jurisdictions are enacting right now that are, proven to really reduce demand, remove buyer anonymity, and we wanted to elevate those and allow people to talk to each other and see what they could be doing in their own jurisdictions short of passing legislation. And then finally, to elevate what we call the survivor model, which is also known as the equality model or the Swedish model. Maine was the first US state to adopt this approach in 2023. They are implementing it right now. They're finding some tremendous success, and we wanted to highlight some of the successes that we've seen from jurisdictions across the globe as well. It is now shown to be a primary prevention strategy for sex trafficking, as well as a really important victim-centered approach. So some of the key findings from the report, we ultimately concluded from not just the hobby board conversations, but we also consulted with one of our partners, the EPIC Project, which is based out on the Pacific Northwest. This is an organization that is run by male allies in the movement. One of the things that EPIC does is they place decoy ads in several cities throughout the United States. So when would-be sex buyers are seeking to purchase sex, they realize very quickly that they're actually texting with one of their trained volunteers, and that individual seeks to discourage them from purchasing sex. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. And so we highlighted about 10 of those conversations as well, just to show that irrespective of the venue, sex buyer attitudes are fairly consistent. And so we highlighted some of those conversations as well. And based on those, we analyzed them, we summarized them, as you'll see in the next slides, that buyers seem to be fully aware and on the whole indifferent to overt signs of trafficking, coercion, violence, substance abuse, and desperation in the people that they are soliciting for sex. For instance, they will tell each other, just be careful, this one has a pimp. He might be in the closet, so beware. They don't offer to help this individual. They don't help this woman. They're just, it's more of an FYI for the other guys who come along. They'll say, so-and-so is just optimal high right now, and she's really good if you catch her right now. But if you catch her in like an hour or so, then she'll be too high and not worth it. So just FYI, if you catch her right now, that'll be a perfect time. They'll talk about there being children in the room, again, undeterred by that fact. They'll talk about instances of the individuals being very young. They fetishize these individuals, so they display overt racism. Some of them talk about enacting violence on the individuals they purchase for sex. I want to take a minute to talk about this graph. This is one of the infographics that we have in the report. On our website, under our fact sheets, we have several more instances of jurisdictions, but here's just a snapshot where we talk about the demographic comparisons between sex buyers across several jurisdictions in the country versus that of sex trade survivors. So if you look, in most jurisdictions across the country, we know that the overrepresentation of people in the sex trade are predominantly women and girls of color. And we're talking overwhelmingly African American women and girls and youth, and indigenous women and girls predominantly. And so here are just some of the stats, and this is even in jurisdictions where they're underrepresented. So here we have in Louisiana, 54% of child sex trafficking victims are Black. but they're underrepresented in the jurisdiction. In Ohio, 39% of child victims were of color. In King County, which is the area around Seattle, Washington, we know that Black people are less than 7% of the general population, but they are more than 40% of the child sex trafficking victims. In that same jurisdiction, the sex buyers are 74% white men. And to give you an idea, white people are 66% of the population. So that's even, disproportionate there. But you'll see the blue column is the percentages of sex buyers across the country. And so in Ohio, 85% of sex buyers identified by law enforcement were white men. 73% were in King County, were white men. 74% of sex buyers in Pennsylvania were white men. And in Minnesota, this is from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women report to the legislature from 2020. Researchers indicated that sex buyers in Minnesota are, quote, often white, middle-aged, married men who seek out indigenous women for sex. So again, it's not to say all sex buyers everywhere are white men, but for the jurisdictions that have started to collect this data, they have found that on the whole, predominantly, they tend to be white men, and they tend to be soliciting predominantly women and girls of color. And again, usually when this data is collected, it's usually online solicitations. One of the other key findings that we talk about in this report in terms of strategies is that full decriminalization, and we'll talk about prostitution policy, is a failed policy approach because it results in increased sex trafficking and frustrates state efforts to hold exploiters accountable. And then finally, approaches that reduce demand and prioritize services for sex trade survivors help to prevent trafficking and promote survivor stability. So the next few slides are a little trigger warning. These are just a few of the examples of quotes from sex buyers that we were able to pull. Again, these are all fairly recent. We didn't dig for any of these. If you just go to USA Sex Guide, put in your city, you don't have to look very far. This is an example from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, from a man who felt like this was the philosophy. But many of them just had overt misogyny, overt dehumanization, really no regard for women or the individuals that they are purchasing. This is another one from Dayton, Ohio, 2024. Again, the type of fetishization we see, many of them are seeking a certain type of woman. Many are seeking young Asian girls. Many are looking for Black women, Latina. There was one instance where they were seeking out Ukrainian women, Kazakh women, Russian women. And then here, this one was looking for pregnant women. But again, very dehumanizing, very disrespectful, misogynist attitudes. Here's another one, again, fetishizing, racist, dehumanizing, from Biloxi, Mississippi. And the way that we organized these were regional. So we did West Coast, we did Southern United States, Midwest, and really just wanted to show that across the country, these attitudes were consistent, and they were consistent amongst the epic conversations as well. Again, these were some of the ones that I felt comfortable sharing with you today. Trigger warning for those who go through the report. We highlighted about 5 from each region. There are additional ones, about 20 or more in the appendix for those who want to go through all of them. So these are across, around 90 conversations. We went through and basically summarized the attitude. About 28 indicate the person being reviewed or purchased was acutely vulnerable. So either There was a language barrier. They were very obviously, addicted to drugs. 28, expressed objectification. So you'll see here, how many indicated racism, misogyny, specifically young women, transphobia. Several discussed law enforcement and gave each other warnings about, avoid this area, or, I'm not going to this area anymore. Their law enforcement presence has been, increased. Some were very, disappointed about safety precautions that the, sex trade survivors were taking. And then some talked about, one of them specifically talked about enacting violence against the individual they purchased for sex, and said, if her friend wasn't there, she's lucky her friends were there, or I would have basically done more. And so in terms of legislative models on the sex trade, we know that there are several competing models. Obviously, the US predominantly has criminalization. Many people talk about legalization, which is, what we have in a few counties in Nevada. That's what we have in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, Germany, where there's an estimated 1.2 million sex buyers per day. And that's what we have through sex tourism. But what is predominantly discussed and what we're seeing across the nation now is this debate around full decriminalization, or what's commonly known as decriminalizing sex work, which is a policy approach that seeks to repeal all aspects of the prostitution transaction. So it would make selling sex legal, pimping legal, sex buying legal, and brothels legal. And then what we call the survival model, or the Swedish model, which would only make the selling of sex legal, basically recognize it as a form of violence for the prostituted person, offer that individual services, help to clear and expunge their records, and then offer them exit support, but maintain all of the criminal prohibitions against pimping, purchasing sex, and brothels. And we have found through evidence from the jurisdictions that have implemented this, that this deters sex buying, it reduces demand, reduces trafficking, and helps curb the behavior, and has a normative effect on the culture over time. So this is just a helpful graphic that we've developed to show the differences between decriminalizing sex work and the survivor model. And then ultimately, here are some of the successes that we highlight in the report. So, this is a legal approach that has been implemented in a number of diverse jurisdictions. It's the leading global policy response to reforming the sex industry. Again, it was recently implemented in the state of Maine. And there are several other jurisdictions that have legislation pending right now. So Illinois, New York, last year Massachusetts had legislation that got very far, actually. And it's been shown to reduce demand. For example, we mentioned in the report that in Sweden, the Minister for Trafficking has said that, sex trafficking is basically dead in Sweden. And when you look at the neighboring countries that have legalization by comparison, it's a huge problem. There's human trafficking, organized crime, and in places like Germany and the Netherlands, for example. In the Netherlands, they're shutting down a third of their window brothels. They've spent millions seeking to discourage tourism into the red light district because of the type of tourists it attracts. And so here, France probably has the most comprehensive version of the survivor model, and here are some of the successes. You can see here they have had, 0 arrests of prostituted people as compared to 2,500 arrests of prostituted people prior to the law. Over 1,200 people have benefited from exit programs. 95% have found stable employment, and more than 2.4 million euros have been confiscated from exploiters and reinvested into survivor services. And so that's basically an overview of the report. I'll just highlight really quickly, I know we're over time, but the really 3 innovative solutions from the states that we wanted to highlight were comprehensive buyer accountability programs. These are basically multi-week court-mandated programs very different than your average John schools. The one that we highlight in particular was first founded in Seattle, but it's since been replicated in a number of other jurisdictions. And what it would basically do is, sex buyers who are found to be soliciting are referred to the program. They have to pay a pretty hefty fine in Seattle. It's a $5,000 fine that goes to Finance Victim Services. And it's a several-week program. It's about a 10-week program that has several different issues, and that it's basically a group. It's like group therapy, essentially. And we talk about in the report the evaluations. And so you can see the outcomes and the change in mindset that has happened with these sex buyers. Some are irredeemable, but many have had a change in mindset, and some have even come back to be facilitators in the program. And an example is the community accountability efforts in San Francisco. They have engaged the community to help deter high areas of street prostitution by submitting photos of cars that are picking up prostituted people. They don't get arrests, they get a letter home with a picture of their car that says, you were found to be picking up a prostituted person. Here's your picture of your car. It might cause some uncomfortable conversations at home, but removing that buyer anonymity has been found to be a deterrent. And they are basically seeking to reduce demand that way. And then finally, Cook County, Illinois, has sought to repair this fraught relationship between law enforcement and the survivor community by engaging survivor leaders, hiring them, and stop arresting survivors, shifting their attention to sex buyers, and again, fining them if they use their car to solicit, impounding the car, using those fines to finance victim services. And so they've seen tremendous success there as well. And so we lift up those models that are short of legislative change. And so with that, I will invite Nora Hennick, who's going to be our moderator for the panel, again, our co-author on the report. So thank you again, and I'll invite Nora up.
Turning on? Oh, there we go. Hi, everyone. I am Nora Hennick. I am the Communications Director for the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. We are a legal advocacy group working to end the sexual exploitation and trafficking of women and girls. And we are based in New York City, but we do our work all around the world. So I am going to invite my fellow panelists up here. We'll start with Robbie Hamilton. She is a survivor leader and the youth mentor at New Friends, New Life here in Dallas. And then next we'll have Melanie Thompson, my colleague, also a survivor leader and the Chief Outreach and Advocacy Officer at CATW. And then we have Ty Bowden, the Associate Director of the NET in Fort Worth. And then, of course, Bianca Davis, who you've all met, and Yasmin, who you all know. So, Yasmin, thank you for that beautiful, comprehensive summary of the report. And I know, as you and I were working on it, it kept growing in scope. But I think you always had a very clear vision of what you wanted this report to achieve. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you see this report being used in advocacy work, in the public, for legislators, in all those spheres.
So, one of the things that we are dealing with as an advocacy organization that works across the U.S. is that many states and jurisdictions are actually introducing bills to decriminalize prostitution. We are in many states. Just last week, Rhode Island had a hearing in the Senate on a full decriminalization bill. And we have a section on Rhode Island. Rhode Island is one of the only states to have actually decriminalized indoor prostitution for a 29-year period between 1989 and 2009. And they changed their laws back because it was such a disaster. But again, there's a lot of folks that stand to financially benefit. People forget that the sex trade is a multi-billion-dollar industry that stands to really, again, financially gain from becoming legitimized and legalized. So We're dealing with it again. We had a hearing. Many survivors came out. Many advocates came out and testified against this legislation, but many testified for it. There's legislation in New York. There has been ballot initiatives that we have fought against in Oregon, bills in Louisiana, in Massachusetts, in New Hampshire, in many, many states. So I know it sounds crazy to think about, but it all started in Washington, D.C. in 2019. That bill got a hearing and over 200 people testified. I'd say equal numbers on both sides. It was a 12-hour, 14-hour hearing. And it legitimized this issue. And since then, we've seen these bills pop up all over the country. And so what we wanted with this report was to have almost a one-stop shop for advocates and survivor leaders in jurisdictions all across the country to show that, sex buyers and sex buying is not innocuous. It is harmful. That the violence that individuals experience in the sex trade, whether they are children, whether they are adults, is lifelong. It's psychological, it's physical, and it's lifelong. And we wanted them to be armed with, quotes from buyers from all over the country, case studies about jurisdictions where it's been shown that full decriminalization is a failure, increases in sex trafficking, disproportionately marginalized groups and vulnerable groups that suffer, and to have the data right there. And instead, these proven solutions from jurisdictions where demand reduction solutions work, that they reduce violence, that they reduce trafficking, and that they have really great outcomes. I mean, some of the sex buyers from, the program in Seattle, for example, talk about how it's changed their life in a great way. It's actually benefited them personally. And so, we really hope that it's an advocacy tool. We include sample legislation in the appendix as well. And we just really hope that it can be a one-stop shop in many ways. It can have all the arguments right there, all the data right there. And we really just hope it's useful to advocates and folks that maybe just aren't familiar with these issues, and they can really just understand what's happening here and what's happening globally.
That's great. And for those who maybe don't want to carry around the report, we also have lots of social media content on Rights for Girls, Instagram. So that's always great to share, just having some of those demographic and sex buyer quotes. It's very easy to share and get amplification on that. So I want to turn to both Robbie and Melanie at this point. So obviously, reading these words from the sex buyers is difficult for a lot of people, very graphic. And also, just to reiterate on what Yasmin said earlier, it's not like we dug for this content. We didn't cherry pick the worst of the worst. It was right there for the looking. So I wanted to ask both of you, why do you think it's important for people to read these words, and why do you think it was important for the report to include them?
You can hear me okay? I hope everyone in this room will read this report. I think that there are among some people the misconception that the men, the buyers, are, like Yasmin was saying earlier, these shy, aw shucks, can't get a date, one-time buyers. And that's simply not the truth. They are repeat, felonious perpetrators. And there is often violence. And once you read the words, you'll really be able to see not just the lack of respect, the lack of any consideration for the very human being they're having sex with. And it's just a sick, repeated cycle. And, y'all, so I'm a survivor. I've been sober 22 years. I've been arrested for, thank you. I have been arrested for buying drugs repeatedly. Well, they put me in drug treatment. I had a criminal record, although I no longer do, Natalie. And I was the problem. I was the buyer. Where are the men? Where are the men? They need to be, they are the ones that are driving this global problem. And so I really hope that people will read this report, that they will see the buyer's words, their own words, and that it will propel change. Because if we no longer have a demand, we're not going to need us. So thank you.
I don't want to follow that, but but I mean, everything that Robbie said, and quite frankly, I think, as was mentioned already, I think a lot of times when we try to prosecute, hey friend, how we try to prosecute this issue, or when we focus on this issue, we focus a lot on the trafficker, right? Especially in law enforcement nationally and statewide, we focus a lot on, oh, well, the trafficker is selling, the trafficker kidnaps, the trafficker inflicts violence, and rightfully so, right? They need to be held accountable. But for me personally, I think the buyers are always left out of the conversation. And I think that we completely omit in the conversation the buyer's sense of entitlement. And I mean, I'm sure this will be answered throughout the conversation, but one of the things that I always highlight when talking about this issue is how this is not about purchasing sexual access, which is what on the surface it seems like it's about purchasing power and control. And when you look at it from that lens, then you recognize that it's actually the buyers who sometimes inflict more harm on the victim like myself than the trafficker, because the way that our system currently views buyers is like it's a one-off action. If they get caught for purchasing or soliciting, then you'll see, I don't even know what it is legally, but if they get caught for trying to buy sex, then it's like you get a fine or you might get jail time for 24 hours, right? And we look at it like they just did it one time, send them away. But what makes them so powerful and scary is the fact that they repeat, right? Because they know that our legal system is going to say, right? And that's the problem. We look at the traffickers, we say they're the bad ones, but quite frankly, if the buyers weren't there, that reduces the demand, and if there's no demand, there'd be no supply, right? So traffickers have nothing to actually traffic if nobody's purchasing. And I think that they know that, they're not idiots, buyers know that, they can get off scot-free, and that's why we need to be focusing the conversation on the buyers, aside from the traffickers.
Exactly. Yeah. While you were speaking, I was just thinking about a statistic. We've been doing a lot of research into the Netherlands, where prostitution is legal, and a group that actually is advocating for legalization came out with a study saying that 90% of prostituted women have experienced violence at the hand of sex buyers. So, pretty staggering. So I'm going to turn it to Ty right now. I was hoping you could speak a little bit about your work in disrupting the demand and interacting with men who are attempting to purchase sex, and if you see the attitudes in the report reflected in the men you are working with.
Yeah. My name is Ty Bowden. I'm the Associate Director at the NET, which is an anti-trafficking org west of here in Tarrant County. So we've been serving survivors since 2012. And then the last 10 years, we have a program called MASE, which stands for Men Against Sexual Exploitation, and that has been our demand reduction initiative. So for the last 10 years, we have been really focusing on this issue very locally, and it's grown a lot in the last 10 years, so I'll try to touch on where we've ended up. So since 2016, we've partnered with EPIC, which is in the report, so a lot of those conversations that you see, I've been on the end of those text and phone calls, working to engage and disrupt these buyers. In Texas, solicitation of prostitution, adult prostitution became a felony, state jail felony in 2021. And so for the last 3.5 years, we've also been working with our local law enforcement as they go out and prioritize arresting these buyers. And we're gonna talk more about kind of the local law enforcement and what that looks like. But so the best statistics we have said that about 20% of men will buy sex at some point in their life. And so that's a large number, obviously, about 6-8% in any given year. But that also means that there's 90-something% of men who are not buying every year. And so a large focus of our work is on community education. Because what we know is that there are a lot of things that contribute to someone who buys sex, but not everyone who comes from has neglect and abuse in their background or who is experiencing loneliness by sex, right? And so we really focus on educating the community so that they can kind of be upstream of that and prevent people from becoming sex buyers in the first place. I think we can all agree that that would be better than having to catch these guys after they've already perpetrated this act. But we also know that right now, like Melanie just said, the vast majority of these men do not think about the consequences of their actions at all. And so we really are working to strip that anonymity from the men who are attempting to buy sex here in North Texas. And then also, since it has become a state jail felony, and now our law enforcement and our DA's offices actually have the tools that they need to prioritize these arrests. You know, it's a Class B misdemeanor, and you've got well-resourced buyers who are gonna lawyer up. That's not worth any prosecutor's time. But now that it's a state jail felony, it is, and we are actually seeing them go after that. And so we're working with our law enforcement to go after these men, and then as they are, you know, most of them are getting 2 years felony probation, another conversation, but then as they are, you know, as a condition of their probation, they're sending them back to us where we have a course for them that we call our Education and Restoration Program. It's not a Peter Qualiteen level program. We haven't gotten buy-in for that necessarily yet. But we're really focusing on, we know that we cannot arrest our way out of this problem. The very first operation that the Tarrant County Sheriff's Office did in 2021 after the law passed, they did a 30-day operation in September, and they arrested the same guy on the first one, and then while he was awaiting indictment, they arrested him 3 weeks later. And so he has a pending felony charge, and he's out here doing it again. And so we know that we have to, there has to be education and heart and behavior change for these men not to come back and do this again. And so that's what we've really been focusing on. And I think Melanie nailed it in that they're not buying sex, they're buying control and power. And so when you see these attitudes, when you talk to these men in person, you often, you know, man to man, obviously, you're not going to see that dark nature. But then you go look at the text messages that they were sending the undercover officers, and it's exactly what you just saw. It's kind of like a lot of other things in our very digital society. It's really easy to be a keyboard warrior. It's really easy to dehumanize and objectify someone that you are paying so that they cannot say no to you. And so it's really important that we understand that while, you know, even when we're having these conversations or our volunteers are following up with these buyers, and we really do want restoration for them so that they're not going to exploit other people in the future, we cannot downplay the extreme misogyny and objectification that they are perpetuating. And so in thousands of conversations that I've had with buyers over the last decade, this is exactly what we see.
Thank you. Bianca, I'm going to give you maybe a philosophical question. So this report touches on culture and on policy. And in your view, what do you think has to change first, culture or policy, in order for, you know, our culture, our society to see the sex trade for what it is, which is violence against women?
That's a great question. And I think history has taught us that it has to be culture first, because human trafficking didn't even become a federal crime until the year 2000. So if we're waiting on the laws to dictate how we treat each other, we're going to miss it, and the victims and survivors can't wait for us to figure it out. There's this quote shared by Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall when they asked him why he ruled the way he did on Brown versus Board of Education. He said, "You have to do what's right and let the laws catch up." And I think that's the space where we're in, where we have the opportunity to help educate law enforcement and policymakers on what's needed. But that's driven by our human desire to care for and support each other, and then sharing that with the policymakers to enact the laws that support that. But if we wait on policy, there's just going to be more victimization along the way.
Perfectly said. So Yasmin briefly touched on the 4 main legislative models regarding prostitution earlier. And I wanted to ask Melanie, kind of touching also on the culture piece, why do you think these calls to decriminalize so-called sex work have gained so much traction in the public imagination, in media, and the survivor model hasn't really caught on fire yet?
Yeah, so I don't know if everybody keeps noticing we put sex work in quotes. I think I have to address that. I'm speaking for me and my colleague, we don't use the term sex work. I personally don't. I know that it's a term that's trending right now when it comes to this issue, and people think that it's like the politically correct term or it's the polite term. Nobody wants to say prostitution. It's so icky. Ooh, we want to stay away from that. However, the term sex work is legitimizing prostitution as a form of work like any other, and that's a problem for me. I like to say that sex work can be neither. Sex cannot be work and work cannot be sex. And the reason that I say that is because there is a system. Prostitution is a system that is predicated on other oppressive systems, more namely misogyny, patriarchy, sexism, racism, and so on and so forth. So when you view the system of prostitution as that, then it removes this individualized autonomy that sex work kind of gives, right? It gives this idea that we can make the choice, that we're empowered individuals in choosing this, when we as the experts here know that prostitution is a system that exploits the most vulnerable and marginalized in our society. With that being said, I think that kind of contributes to society's thought process on this idea of sex work and decriminalizing it. I think that there's this false narrative that, again, most people, because they think it's an individual's choice, they're like, well, so what if she's over 18 or they're over 18 and they want to join a strip club, have an OnlyFans, do any of that stuff, right? Like, it's their choice. And I think most of our states, even though across the US we're predominantly practicing criminalization, I think just colloquially or in our local society, in our culture, we have this idea that we should be able to do whatever we want with our bodies. And I think that's a pretty argument. It's nice to think that we have this much autonomy over ourselves. Unfortunately, in the system of prostitution, we don't. So when we're trying to fully or advocate for full decriminalization of this issue, it's predicated and founded and based on this falsified ideology of bodily autonomy, sex positivity, empowerment, right? Female empowerment. But the reality is that it's the demand who actually holds the majority of that power. And then second to demand, it's the traffickers that hold the majority of that power. So when we view this issue as a system, we can never see it as work, A. B, when we actually come to the realization that I don't really have as much power as I thought, even if I don't have a pimp, right? It's still the demand that's holding that power, then of course I can't get behind decriminalizing sex work. But I think part of the reason why it's not being pushed is what we're seeing in the media, what we're seeing in music videos, what we're seeing in our culture, this ideology. And it's hard when, maybe 5 of us up here, is it 5? 6 of us up here, right? I can't do math. So 6 of us up here might be saying, well, no, prostitution is violence, sex trafficking is violence. But if however many of you guys are there feel like sex work is work, or I think it's fine. I think they can strip. It's hard to combat that, right? And I think we're seeing this in our culture. I think we see it in our legal system. I think that our politicians are less and less afraid of taking an actual stance against the masses, right? And we can go on. I can have a whole other panel on what I'm seeing with my local politicians, right? And why they're afraid to kind of call that out. But the reality is that it's hard to compete with the media and people's individual autonomy and thoughts, and what we're seeing in academia and the kind of push for this idealization of sex work, right? It's hard to combat all of that. So I think that was a long way of saying, right? To answer your question more directly, I think this is part of the reason why full decriminalization and the sex work is work ideology is gaining so much traction. It's hard to combat the masses that are unfortunately ignorant to this issue.
Yeah, boom, everything.
Yeah, you said it all. And Robbie, kind of taking a different angle from it, why do you, coming from a survivor perspective, why do you not only support the survivor model, but why do you advocate for it?
I don't know. Thank you. That was, so I don't know how many of y'all have heard of Giselle Pellicot out of France. That she said something very simple, because shame must shift sides. And, we all know what the woman looks like. We all know what the woman, even if we're just envisioning it in our own mind, on the street corner, on the track, behind the camera, all of that, we know what that looks like. And we know the trafficker, what the trafficker looks like, the fedora, that's not really true, but we know that. But what about the buyer? y'all, I can't tell y'all how many times I was in and out of Lou Sterrett, and the woman was on the phone trying to get a free phone call to call somebody to get her out, and she knew everyone's name there at the jail, all the guards. Hey, Ralph, how you doing? Hey, Fred, how you doing? And trying to call someone to get her out, and then the trafficker is back counting her money, the money, and then where's the buyer? Where's the buyer? He's at home with his wife. He's back home with his wife. And even then, even I did not think, well, that's wrong. It was just, boys will be boys. And it's wrong information. It's wrong thinking. There is just this, they get a free pass. They're just this, locker room talk, and it's simply not true. And like Melanie was saying, the violence, and it's the repeat offender. And again, I encourage you to read the report, because the report will show you the way these men think of the women, the prostituted women. And so I completely support, everybody's focused on the women. That's exploitation in and of itself. But we focus on the women and how we can get the woman to stop. When I bought drugs, they focused on the buyer and how we can, holding people accountable for their behavior promotes change. And holding buyers accountable for their behavior can promote change. And if there's not a demand, there isn't going to be a reason. There will be no one to traffic. There will be no one to rehabilitate. And so this is something I am so passionate about. I want to scream from the rooftops. I've got coffee all over my report. And it's just, this could be so changing to this. So I completely support it. The woman is not there by choice. It's lack of choice. It is lack of choice. This was not her plan. This was not her idea at 5. You know what? I know. I'm going to go out and let someone repeatedly sell me. It's not a choice. It's lack of choice. And so we need services for her. We need accountability, and we need to take away the anonymity of the buyer. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to focus on our local panelists right now. So while Texas hasn't enacted the survivor model yet, they were the first state to criminalize sex buyers. So I was hoping, Bianca, Ty, Robbie, you could talk a little bit about other legislative efforts that Texas has made to address demand and prevent sexual exploitation.
I'll start with one. Yeah. I think it was a couple years ago in Texas, we increased the age to work in a sexually oriented business from 18 to 21. And I think for the layman, you may just be like, well, what's the difference or what's the point? But when we know that the foster care system is such a pipeline into trafficking and exploitation, anything that we can do to provide that buffer for a survivor is so important, because even if she's legitimately working in a sexually oriented business as a waitress, we know in that environment, it's only a matter of time before she becomes a trafficking victim. At New Friends, New Life, more than 65% of our women were trafficked in Dallas strip clubs. The Dallas strip club scene is one of the most, for lack of a better word, trafficked strip clubs in the entire country. So putting an 18-year-old in that environment increases her risk of being exploited. And talking about the violence, 81% of the women and girls we see have been strangled by either the buyer or the pimp. And we know that non-fatal strangulation is the last step before homicide. So if we're trying to create a safe community, if we don't want our homicide numbers to be high, we have to look at all of these feeder instances. But increasing the age range is such a nuanced look, and it shows that the city is paying attention on levels that are deeper than just surface. So that's one thing that we did. And then, and I'll turn it over to you, Ty, but the other thing that we participated in a couple of years ago, which also seemed very simple, was having strip clubs closed between the hours of 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. That was such a huge undertaking when the police department goes to the city and says, here's what's happening in this establishment. We just want to give everyone a break. We can help save lives. We can lower our numbers if these establishments are not open. And I remember when we went before the city council, there were 50 people that spoke on this issue. 47 of them were the strip club owners and the women who worked there. And there were 3 of us on the other side saying, here's why we should close this. And initially it was voted on 14-0 by city council. We were so excited, but within an hour, the sexually oriented business owners had an attorney sue the city, and it took 2 years to enact this policy. And what they wanted was data. And it goes back to how important it is to gather data and have information across the board that really validates why we need to make certain decisions. We know that data drives policy. And so having the strip clubs closed, it seems like such a small thing, from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. Was really an important step. And what was scary about it was the reasoning from the business owners. They're like, we want to make Dallas an entertainment destination. We're like, hey, how about not do that in an environment where people are strangled and assaulted and raped and all of this criminal activity is happening? So behind legitimate businesses like SOBs, which is the actual abbreviation. I'm not trying to say anything bad, but I'm saying, that's what we call them, SOBs, sexually oriented businesses. Behind these legitimate businesses, this awful crime is taking place. And so how do we make a difference there?
Yeah, and then at the state level, boiling down the survival model really simply, it's criminalizing buyers and traffickers and providing services and decriminalizing prostituted individuals. And Shared Hope International every year does a statutory review of all state anti-trafficking statutes, and Texas got a C last time. And if you look at the detailed breakdown, we get an A in criminalization. We're going after the buyers and traffickers, which is awesome. We get an F in awareness or buyer identification and intervention. And so we have to make it easier for survivors to get out. We have to make better access to services for survivors. And we have to make it easier once they are out for them to have dignified employment and dignified housing and things like that. So right now, last Wednesday in Austin, Senate Bill 958 got advanced out of committee to get voted on, which expands the record sealing law for survivors. It's not enough. It's still not enough. It doesn't include any felony charges, but it steps in the right direction. And those are the things that we as a state have to keep marching in that direction. We like Nora said, we led the way. We are leading the way in addressing demand through criminal statutes, but that's only half the issue. We can't just keep focusing on criminalization without also providing rehabilitation and restoration.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to you right now, actually, as our sole male representative here. Yes. I was hoping you could speak a bit to, we keep hearing a lot about this rise in male loneliness and isolation and the manosphere online. There was a recent study saying that 1 in 5 Gen Z men admire Andrew Tate, who is a misogynistic influencer and accused human trafficker. So that's obviously very disturbing, these trends. So are you seeing this in the young men that you work with, and how can we fight against this?
Yeah, absolutely. In all conversations that I've had with sex buyers, so sitting down with them, in a La Quinta bathroom, which is always an interesting dynamic while they're in handcuffs, 2 questions, 2 things that are the only common denominators. 1, they all have some sort of pornography addiction, and 2, none of them have community. None of them, those are some of the standard questions we ask them. And I'm always asking, is there someone in your life that you can tell about this? And no one has that person. No one has the friend, the brother, the pastor that they feel comfortable sharing these things with. And it has led, we have a clinical sex addiction therapist who's one of our partners who helped provide content for some of these men in our course. And he says, he's talking to these groups of men that we have quarterly events for, who want to be part of the solution. And he's like, hey, I know most of you, you want to go kick down doors, you want to rescue victims. The best thing that you can do to disrupt demand and prevent future exploitation is to find that lonely guy at your office and take him to lunch. And he walks through a case study of men that he's counseled in the past about how they don't have, whether it's abuse and neglect in their past, which is all too often the case as well, but just this culture of, these kids are being raised by devices, and so they don't know how to have those intimate relationships, and not even sexual intimacy, just relational intimacy. And so when they get to this age where they're, early 20s and they have access to these escort sites and things like that, when they're feeling lonely and overwhelmed, no one has ever taught them these healthy coping skills, and here's how you have community. And so they're doing what they read about on these hobby boards, and they're going out and they're trying to create this false intimacy with, again, someone who can't say no to what they want to do. And so there are obviously deep underlying factors, but that loneliness and the lack of community is a huge, almost universal driver with all the buyers that we've worked with.
So that's a perfect segue for kind of our last portion here, talking about community accountability. So the report concludes on that note. So I wanted to get everyone's thoughts on what you would advise everyone in this room, what they can do to create change, to end violence against women, and to foster accountability in their own communities. I don't know who wants to kick it off.
There's a lot of recommendations. Y'all gonna have to find me after this to figure out that whole list. But I do think that's something that hasn't been mentioned yet, and my recommendation to everybody in the room, in your respective fields and sectors, I know there's some law enforcement in the room, and I know there's some I hate the word politician, but legal people in the room. I think that oftentimes there's a lot of solutions and recommendations that are put forth on this issue that don't include culture. And I don't think I've ever said this before, but I do think that if there's a way that we can get a little bit more creative in our tactics, in how we approach this issue, and bridge culture somewhere into that, then I think that the policies and the approaches that we're taking in your fields will be a lot more effective. I think one of the things that I see across the states is that people are approaching this issue from like a numbers thing. And I know we talked about the importance of, I say data, it's my accent. But I know we're talking about the importance of data, right? And I know that we're talking about how numbers are so important. And I think a lot of times, specifically in law enforcement, numbers are what's fueling how we approach this issue. What's the percent of buyers? What's the percent of victims? What's the percent of traffickers? And I think that's important. But I also think that there's a way to bring culture into the conversation. What is it what's this disconnect between us and our fields and the community and the constituents, right? We're not bridging that gap, and therefore trafficking specifically is not being approached in the proper way. I love that you were saying, that this person said, take the buyer to lunch. Now, obviously, I have some bias, and I'm not going to give my opinion on that. But I will say that that's an example of how we can bridge culture into policy and how we can bridge culture into the way that we are approaching this issue. So I think if we can find more creative alternatives to approaching this issue, then we can get a lot farther than what we have been.
Yeah, I say all the time, knowledge is power. You shine a light on something and it can promote change. And so I think taking the spotlight off the women, and putting it on the buyer and even acknowledging that this does need to change, I think that in and of itself can help bring about change. And like you were saying, shifting the focus, the shame needs to shift, but even trying to look, like you were saying, take them to lunch, just opening up the conversation, opening up the thinking that it's not the women that need to be rehabilitated. It's not the traffickers that need to be sent to prison, although those two things are true. It's the buyers that need to be held accountable, and that the awareness and just shining a light on this whole subject, I really think can make the difference.
Yeah, I agree. I think collaboration, of course, is key. I'm looking at Mrs. Gail Turner over in the corner there, who was one of the founding members of New Friends, New Life. And I think about, I think about what happened when that woman walked into the local church and needing help. And this was before we even understood this is what sex trafficking is, this is its impact on humanity. It was just a group of women who recognized that one woman needed help. And over the years, we've come to identify these major roadblocks that survivors face. And it's not just one agency providing help. It's what are the legal resources that she needs? What are the roadblocks to education, roadblocks to employment, roadblocks when it comes to her criminal record? And so every entity doing their part in solving the problem is how we address the issue, because sex trafficking didn't happen in a silo. So the solution can't come with one single entity. It's moments like today. It's people coming together and connecting the dots between watching pornography and someone being trafficked. That's new to a lot of people. There are a lot of men who say, I've never bought a purse and I'm one of the good guys. But we're like, if you have gone to the strip club for the bachelor party as a rite of passage, you've inadvertently supported this crime taking place. And so I think it's just a collaboration that needs to happen. I'm looking at Natalie Nanasi from the legal clinic here at SMU. And when Robbie just glanced over the fact that she is a fully pardoned individual by the governor of Texas in 2020 on Human Trafficking Awareness Day, her phone rings and it's Governor Abbott saying, it's like it didn't happen. Like, we understand what happened to you while you were being trafficked and what that forced you to do and caused you to do. And here you are with the new life that you deserve. So everyone coming together, Chad, last one, Chad from the North Texas Coalition Against Human Trafficking and all of the agencies that are here. No one agency can do this work alone. I mean, we're all fighting for resources and funding and all the things, but we have to come together on this issue and say, here's my part, here's the role I'm gonna play, and that's how we really make the difference.
I'm going to talk specifically to the men because that's where I specialize, and I try to leave, male audiences that I talk to with two things. And first is, Bianca just said it, you cannot care about trafficking and also consume pornography. Like I mentioned, it's one of the only things that, one of the universal things that drives buyers to do what they do. But the reality of the real life rape and exploitation that's happening on the other side of that camera. And so you can't care about that and actively consume that. And you also can't let the people in your sphere do the same thing. And so it is way sexier to watch movies where people are running through jungles and saving kids. That's not us, for most of us. We have law enforcement in the room. Thank you guys for being here. But for most of us, the vast majority of the guys that I talk to, we're not gonna be doing that. And so what we have to do is look inward, figure out what systems we're propping up, what ways that our power and privilege has been used, purposefully or not, to exploit others. Look inward, do that work first, and then work with the men around us to make sure that we are not doing those things. Because there's a reason there's only one guy and 5 women up here. It's because there's not just 5 times more, but 100 times more women doing this work. And so we have to have men who are willing to look inward and step into the space, whether you're getting paid for it or not. We have a charge because men are the ones who are propping up this entire industry. And so we have to have better men like the men with EPIC, the men who volunteer with MASE, be the ones who are gonna step into that gap and really be the ones to reduce this, so.
I was basically going to, end on a similar note. We talk about, the phenomenon of male loneliness in the report, and, we talk about how important it is for male allies and, men as credible messengers. Because I think, women can't do this alone, and it's very important to have more men engaged in the movement to end violence against women and girls, and especially around this issue. It's very important to have men talk to other men, and every time, we present on these types of issues, we always kind of use the example Bianca alluded to of, very often there are situations where men are hanging out. You can use the bachelor party example, and, you know, most of the guys just want to hang out and drink beers and, you know, talk amongst themselves. But there's one guy who insists on going to the strip club, and, you know, most of the other guys don't want to do it, but he insists. And so they all cave and they all go. But they all say, you know, we just wanted to sit and drink and just stay at the bar. But this one guy kept pushing and we all went. And every time I tell this story, inevitably, you know, a couple guys will come up afterwards and go, that's happened to me so many times, or that definitely happened to me, and we didn't want to go, but we all ended up going. And we just need more guys to realize that they're the majority, and they just need to speak up and hold each other accountable, and all the things that Ty just said. You know, most men don't engage in this type of behavior, but they need to feel more confident and be more outspoken in holding other men accountable. And Peter Qualitine, who we alluded to and who heads up the Seattle program that we lift up in the report, he did a great interview with GQ a few years ago, and I highly recommend folks checking it out. They do an in-depth sit down and review of one of the cohorts of his buyer course. And he talks about how the secret is that men are scared of other men's violence too. And the reality is it's hard to stand up to other men, but we can't do it alone, and we really need all of you in this. And the reality is our communities will all be better for it. And so that would be, you know, I think the last plea. The last thing that we could do as a community is engage more men in the movement to end violence against women and girls. We need more credible messengers to talk to other men, especially boys who are increasingly lonely, and all they have is this manosphere of very toxic, you know, violent role models right now to look to, and that's not healthy for them. It's not healthy for the community. And we at Rights for Girls know that gender-based violence is already pervasive for young women and girls and children right now. And, you know, the last thing we need is to add, you know, kerosene on that fire. So that would be our plea. So I think with that,
Yes, I think we have some time for Q&A. So just raise your hand if you have a question.
So I heard two things here. So in terms of what you're describing as familial trafficking, I'm very passionate about always bringing that into conversation, so thank you. Oftentimes when we think about trafficking as a whole, we're talking about street prostitution, online exploitation, but we kind of leave out either the exploitation of Native and Indigenous women and girls or familial trafficking, which accounts for 38.5% of the population of those that are trafficked. So thank you. We do talk about it, we do highlight it. It is harder to get data on buyers in the home because we can't just walk into people's homes and, you know, do the math. But for those who are exploited by family members or people inside the home that are able to get connected to services or reported to us, then they are included in that data. And there are organizations and individual survivors across all of the states that come together and often talk about this issue. So I can definitely connect you with folks who are doing anti-familial trafficking work. And then you brought up Pretty Woman, which I feel like, I know everyone's looking at me, it's so weird, which I feel like is a great place for me to just drop in a Nora. Everybody's heard of a Nora right now? No? Yeah? Watch the Oscars, anyone? Okay. A Nora is this film that just won 5 Oscars, which is insane. And I could do a whole panel on a Nora, so I won't get into all of it now, but it was marketed as like the better Cinderella story to Pretty Woman, but not really. And it was supposed to be, yeah, I'm not gonna give the movie away, but long story short, it just falsely depicted what trafficking looks like in the in the strip club industry. And it gave this false ideology of like bodily autonomy and power, and it left folks feeling like you can be a boss babe in prostitution and in the strip club industry. And I think going back to Pretty Woman, like even, 40 something years later from Pretty Woman? Exactly, it's still being highlighted, and it's still what people think about when they hear escorting and prostitution. They think of Pretty Woman, and like I was saying earlier to one of my answers to one of your questions was like, that's a pretty narrative, right? Like people think of the happy, quote unquote, happy hooker narrative that like It's not all bad. You can be happy. Majority, I'm sure, Robbie, you and I have never seen or found a Richard Gere in our experiences, right? That's the reality. And I think these types of movies are perpetuating this narrative that it's not all bad. I know there's plenty of other shows that used to come out, 2 series that would highlight, escorting as separate from trafficking, as separate from prostitution or sex work, and this idea that, you'll slip $1,000 cash in an envelope, which is not the reality for the majority of people who have been exploited. So I used your question as an opportunity to say that, but I do think media has a role to play. I think the directors of the films that are being pushed out have a role to play in shaping our culture's overall narrative around this issue. So we'd love to talk to you further about that.
So you can go to our resources page on rightsforgirls.org, and we have a specific fact sheet on violence against Native women and girls. In our fact sheets, we always include Indigenous women and girls. In this report, we touched on it in the graphic that I shared. And we always highlight that they're disproportionately overrepresented among survivors of both sexual violence and sexual exploitation. And what's important to note is that when Indigenous women and girls experience sexual violence and sexual exploitation, it's most often perpetrated by non-Native men, and that's due to jurisdictional issues. Even though the last version of the Violence Against Women Act expanded special tribal jurisdiction, it's very difficult to implement. And I've recently learned this. Our organization does judicial institutes. We have run these with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges for the last 10 years. But we just did a tribal institute in New Mexico on Santa Ana Pueblo. So I just learned that it's very difficult to practically implement the special tribal jurisdiction. So most often non-Native men carry out the violence, again, disproportionately white men, because tribes don't have jurisdiction on non-Natives who commit acts of violence against Native people on tribal land. And yes. Yeah, it's very difficult, but I will tell you, some of our judges didn't even know what MMIP stood for, or MMIW. I mean, I'm talking about, some of them are tribal council, some of them aren't lawyers, some of them are just elders. Like, we're talking little towns in Alaska who had to take like 5 planes to even get to where we were, So the turquoise alert, though, was the Coalition Against Violence Against Native Women, who's an excellent coalition, and one of the leaders of that coalition, her sister went missing back in 2004 and is still missing, unfortunately. So they were behind that initiative. But yes, it's a huge problem and continues to be a huge problem, and is something that we talk about in the report, but we didn't drill down on it. We just talked about the disproportionality, but it's certainly a huge issue, yeah.
So we can all continue the conversation outside. We'll have a little reception, light refreshments. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to SMU. Oh yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I just want to end with one thing. If you've been watching March Madness, you've been probably seeing commercials with some SWAT officers coming out of a hotel room. So CBS 11 did a piece on a demand operation that happened last month, and it's coming out tomorrow night at 10 p.m. on Channel 11. So to Councilmember Willis's point, more people need to know that this is happening. And so tomorrow night at 11 or tomorrow night at 10 on CBS 11, there'll be a news piece on one of these demand operations.
Perfect. And the other thing, you'll see some slides rotating. There are a couple of events that are coming up locally, but I'm glad you mentioned March Madness, because you'll see this amazing campaign that Rights for Girls has started, a billboard campaign that they've run in different cities where the games have been happening. And I think it's so clever. It's madness to think sex buying is just a game. So raising the awareness where we have a lot of people, because we know the magic formula is men with money. We're hosting the FIFA World Cup here in Dallas next year. So we are a part of the Human Rights Workshop workshops and campaigns that are preparing to educate the community about that. And I also want to recognize and thank Davis Prescott, who is here, who's the president of New Friends, New Lives Men's Advocacy Group. So we also work on shifting the conversation with young men, connecting the dots for adults. And on May 12th, we're going to have Lila Mickelwaite here for our men's breakfast, and she's really pushing the effort to shut down Pornhub. We talk a lot about that connection between pornography and trafficking, so she'll be sharing about her work. And there's information about the bus tour, there's information from the Coalition Against the Trafficking in Women, so pay attention to these slides. You'll see QR codes if there's anything you want to grab, and make sure that you hold on to your copy of the report. And you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add real quickly about the campaign. We're doing a nationwide billboard campaign right now for March Madness. If you scan the QR code, it'll take you to our site, but it's a series of revolving messages. So, you know, it's madness to think sex buying is a game, sex buying is foul. You know, it's madness to think sex buyers are just shy guys who can't get dates. It's madness to think that sex buying won't land you a penalty. And then if you go to our site, there'll be data included about the issue. So they're in 8 of the host cities: Providence, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Indianapolis, Atlanta, and San Antonio, where the finals will be. So you'll see them, big billboards, digital billboards all over the country. And yeah, hoping to snag those would-be buyers and get them to think twice, and then just get folks to talk about demand, and hopefully check out the report. So, yep. But thank you all for your time and attention, and yes.